Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to the program on Islam and Science, sponsored by Salam Islamic Studies Center in Huntington Beach, California. My name is Dr. Gerald Grutson. I'm a professor of philosophy and comparative religion at San Jose City College, and I also serve as president of Global Ministries University. We want to welcome Dr. Noah Aydin again to our program. He will speak on the golden age of Islamic science, the common narrative associated with that golden age, and the role of al-Ghazali in understanding the context of this golden age. And we welcome Dr. Noah Aydin, who's a professor of mathematics and statistics at Kenyon College in Ohio. Welcome, Dr. Aydin.
Thank you, Dr. Grutson, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight for the third lecture in the series. So let's start with a quick summary of the first two lectures. So in the first lecture, we talked about the message of the Quran and its harmony with scientific mind. And we argue that Islam provides a solid foundation for scientific inquiry and investigations. And in the second lecture last week, we talked about how Quran contains some verses that point to scientific facts that were discovered many centuries after the Quran. But we also made the point that the Quran has a specific purpose and style in mentioning these facts as ayat, the signs. And it is very important to keep this purpose of the Quran in mind. Those facts are not mentioned like they would be in a book of science. And these recordings of the first two lectures are available on YouTube, and you are welcome to review those lectures or parts of the lectures if you like. So before starting with today's topic, I would like to make a correction to a question last week I received from Dr. Grutson. So Dr. Grutson asked me about a question that involved the concept of ijtihad in Islamic tradition. And I said ijtihad meant consensus, but that was a mistake. I confused that term with another term in the Islamic tradition, that is ijma'. So it is the meaning of ijma' that is consensus, not ijtihad. So ijtihad literally means making an effort. It actually comes from the same root that the word jihad comes, jahada, which literally means making an effort or striving. So the technical meaning of ijtihad is a scholar's making an independent judgment and reasoning based on his best knowledge and judgment to find a solution or answer to a legal question. It can be a brand new novel question that was not considered before, or it can be finding a new ruling, coming up with a new ruling to existing questions. It can be either way. So ijma', on the other hand, means consensus or agreement of Islamic scholars on a point of Islamic law. And this is considered to be third fundamental source of Sharia or Islamic law in Islam after the Quran and the Hadith. So the question was pertaining, whether scholars can come up with new understandings or interpretations of verses of the Quran. So the concept of ijtihad is more general in Islam. It usually refers to making a new ruling, not necessarily coming up with new interpretations of the verses of the Quran. So there is a very important discipline in Islamic sciences called tafsir, which means Quranic exegesis, which is all about, interpretations of the verses of the Quran. And those interpretations not necessarily, they do not necessarily come up with new rulings. it can be just new understandings of the Islamic Quranic verses. If those interpretations involve making new rulings, then the concept of ijtihad comes into play. But otherwise, the interpretation of the Quran, the tafsir, is a very important discipline in Islamic sciences. So I wanted to make this clarification and correction to correct my inaccurate statement from last week. Okay, so now let's look at today's topic. So we are going to talk about the golden age of Islamic science, the nature of this golden age, and then the common narrative that talks about this golden age. And we'll talk about inaccuracies of this common narrative, also widespread misconceptions about Islamic contributions to math and sciences. And we'll also talk about the role of Imam Ghazali, who was one of the prominent theologians in the Islamic tradition. And particularly, we'll discuss, a very brief discussion of the nature of debate between Imam Ghazali and Muslim philosophers. Okay, so let me just briefly mention the state of affairs in the Muslim world in regards to this topic. Whenever I start talking about this subject, I often immediately hear some of the misconceptions, like, usually a friend would say, I know that Muslims invented zero. What else did they, contribute? Of course, this is false information, right? Muslims did not invent zero, even though English words zero comes from Arabic sifr. It is still not the case that Muslims invented zero. So another popular misconception I often hear, people somehow associate the term algebra with Jabir bin Hayyan. That's probably because algebra and Jabir sound familiar. Particularly in Turkish, we call algebra Cebir, and Cebir is very similar to Jabir. And maybe it is all in Turkish society that algebra and Jabir are associated with each other, which is completely inaccurate. But this false information is very common, and it is even in books, and it's really amazing. But at the same time, the accurate information is usually not known. So I see the most common state of affairs in this topic is complete ignorance, right? So most people hardly know anything about this subject, but some people maybe vaguely heard some things about Islamic contributions to math and sciences, but it is often inaccurate, like I mentioned in these examples, and often exaggerated. On the other hand, some people in the Islamic world, Muslim world, I have seen it firsthand, there is hostility towards anything Islamic and Arabic, and there is this notion that the religion of Islam has nothing to do with scientific progress, and we should, leave religion behind, and it only caused backwardness. It was the reason for the Muslim world falling behind in science and technology. There is these extreme views and exaggerations, and the accurate information is largely lacking, unfortunately. So, that's because there is a huge lack of research, and areas like history and philosophy of science don't get enough attention in the Muslim world. Everybody wants to go after, areas that are either lucrative or more prestigious. These areas, they are not really popular, unfortunately. And another unfortunate situation is that the situation is not and was not much better in the academic world either. There there have been a lot of misconceptions and misattributions in the academic world as well. And so here's an example. George Sarton, I'm sure many of you know about him. He is a prominent historian of science. In fact, he is regarded as the founder of modern history of science. He was a Harvard professor and very well-known figure in history of science. And here is a paper he wrote in 1935 about the history of decimal fractions and decimal point. And in this paper, he clearly attributes the invention of the decimal point and decimal fractions to European scholar Simon Stevan. And he says, it was Stevan and no other who introduced this concept into mathematical domain. And he makes this statement that the beginning of this concept can be very exactly dated as 1585, late 16th century, due to his book on the subject. So that was 1935. A lot happened in the decades that followed. The researchers discovered a lot of new information based on studying primary sources in 1940s and 1960s, and that information became, it was proven to be false, far from being accurate, and researchers show that this concept was introduced much earlier, many centuries before Simon Stevan, by Islamic scholars. However, that information somehow did not become common knowledge. Even forget about that information getting to the general public. Even very highly educated people, even researchers, some researchers who are writing about the subject, continue to hold this inaccurate belief about the history of decimal point and decimal fractions. So here's a book which I have in my hand here, that is published in 21st century, more than 70 years after Sarton's inaccurate description of the history of decimal fractions. And so this book continues to make this false claim that Stevan was the inventor. So here is a foreword to this book by a Nobel laureate. So Dr. Hooft, who was the Nobel laureate in physics in 1999, he repeats this claim, which is basically just restatement of the fact that is within the book, because the authors simply repeat this false information, right? They are saying that Stevan is no less than the author of the first textbook about decimal fractions. So this inaccurate information was shown to be false decades earlier, like as early as 1948. This book was written like 60 years after researchers learned that the more accurate information about the history of decimal fractions, but somehow even highly educated people like that, they somehow didn't get the accurate information for some reason. And what is even worse about it is that the authors of this book pretend to talk about the history of decimal point and decimal fractions, but they leave out the most important figures. We are going to talk about the details of this in the next lecture when I talk about specific contributions of Islamic scholars to mathematics and sciences. We are going to look into this question in more details. It is really astonishing that they are doing this. If they didn't talk about this, the history of decimal system, it would have been more meaningful. But the fact that they pretend to talk about the history of it and leaving out the most important figures, it is even more amazing, more astonishing, and like, to say the truth, it is more sad that they are doing this. But here we go. This is what happens even among researchers and academics. Though there has been progress on this matter, there is still ways to go. So, the big part of the problem is what we call the classical narrative that talks about the role of Islamic civilization. So, so there is classical narrative basically is a certain point of view, certain ideology that is behind this common narrative of history of science. It has a very long history. So here is a quote from Petrarch, who was considered to be one of the early humanists, and this is his point of view, right? So he couldn't believe that anything good can come from the Muslim world. This is 14th century, but the same mentality is very common, and a lot of people still subscribe to it in 20th century and up to this date, right? So look, the second quote here captures a lot of mentality and assumptions about the of the classical narrative mindset, which is to say that there was the brilliant Greek science, and then there was Dark Ages, in which nothing interesting happened except that there was some minor contribution from the Islamic world in terms of preserving Greek science by translations. And then they made it available to European scholars, who were then reconnected by the Greco-Roman history legacy to revive the brilliant Greek science. So the role of Islamic civilization, according to this point of view, was to simply preserve and imitate the brilliant Greek science, right? So that has been a very common narrative. Of course, not everybody subscribes to this anymore, and there is progress on this. However, it's been around for so long, and it's been engraved in the society for so long that it really takes a lot of effort to correct these misconceptions and this mentality. So details of this classical narrative is discussed by a prominent historian of science, George Saliba, who is a professor of Islamic science at Columbia University. And until I read his book that I am using as a textbook in my course, I didn't know about the classical narrative. But as soon as I read about it, it resonated very well and strongly with me, because I immediately realized that, I witnessed this in so many different contexts, including my hometown, and during my education in my home country, to local school district in rural Ohio, and many books on history of science. So, so this classical narrative mindset, we can see it is manifest in many books and documents. So here is a classical book on classical narrative. So look what they say, right? Muslim scholars, were thinkers only in a restricted sense, and we must not expect to find anything as brilliant as the Greek scientists, because Arabs are Muslims are inferior to Greeks. They assume that they cannot achieve anything as good as what Greeks did, right? So therefore we should not expect to find anything as original and great, as brilliant as the Greek science in Islamic works. So that is, look, this is the beginning on the section on astronomy and math, right? So they state their assumption up front, and then they approach they view the scientific material is from the Muslim world, Islamic world, with this point of view, right? So with this assumption in the background, and that really changes what you see in these documents, because of the prejudice and the way you look at them. It is with this point of view, it is very easy to miss a lot of original contributions because you are not expecting to find it there. But that was a book that was published in 1931, right? Now, look, here's a book from 21st century, much more recent, and this is the beginning of the chapter on algebra, right? So it starts by downplaying the role of al-Khwarizmi, who is the father of algebra. He says, "Oh, simple algebra of al-Khwarizmi was not as good as his sophisticated predecessors." I mean, this is really amazing. This is the point of view they attribute to one of the great scholars of Islamic science and the father of algebra. I mean, so we can see this mentality in many different places and books. And these are not like ordinary people. These are like researchers who are writing books on the subject. So there are many misconceptions and misrepresentations and misattributes by this point of view. So again, according to this narrative, the main role of Islamic civilization is that of being a fridge to preserve Greek science. And this point of view focuses on politics and religious events when they examine Islamic world and their contributions, with little to no attention to the intellectual accomplishments. So again, we are not saying that every scholar is like that, but we are saying that this is a very common phenomenon, unfortunately. And we already talked about preservation and viewing Islamic scholar as is inferior to Greek scientists. And this point of view also assumes that the Golden Age was a short period from 9th to 12th century, and it assumes that Imam al-Ghazali killed this Golden Age, ended the Golden Age, by his attack on philosophers that we are going to talk about later today, when he criticized Islamic philosophers by one of his books. And the classical narrative mindset also brings the paradigm of conflict between religion and science from the European setting, and they apply this paradigm to Islamic world, and they view Imam al-Ghazali, as representing orthodoxy in the Islamic world. And when that orthodoxy won, they say, it was the end of the scientific progress in the Muslim world. They may also say, well, if not al-Ghazali, then the Mongol invasion of Baghdad did it, right? And therefore, they say, we should not really expect to find anything important in terms of scientific progress in the Islamic world after al-Ghazali or Mongol invasion of Baghdad in the next century. So as a result of this assumption, a lot of very important scientific works in the Muslim world have been missed by modern researchers. And a lot of researchers make this point that they couldn't really write the history of mathematics in the Islamic world. For example, this is Bergren saying this. Such a book cannot be written yet because so much material remains unstudied. They keep discovering new and new materials. So Victor Katz is saying the same thing. A complete history of math in the Islamic world cannot be written yet because so many of these Arabic manuscripts lie unstudied, even unread in libraries throughout the world. And David King is saying the same thing. Even in the Muslim world, their contributions, their achievements have been completely forgotten. All of the material in this book have never been researched before in modern times. So he wrote two, among his other accomplishments, other products, he wrote two huge volumes about Islamic astronomy, each around 1,000 pages. And this is what he says in these books. This is the first time anyone studied this material in modern times. And Edward Kennedy, another prominent historian of Islamic science, describes the situation as embarrassment of riches. Embarrassment of riches. We keep finding a lot of new materials every day. New manuscripts about Islamic science that have never been studied before. And even this book that we mentioned before, that was written in 1931 with the classical narrative mindset, being dominant, even they say that the mass of new material that we discover has gone so far to dismantle our former conceptions. Even they say this. And a lot happened after 1930s. A lot of more new materials have been studied by modern researchers after this date. So that has been one substantial damage caused by this classical narrative mindset. The alternative narrative, on the other hand, again proposed by Professor Saliba, it is based on research on primary sources, whereas the classical narrative was based on lack of research, right? It was more ideological and assumptions without having, evidence from primary sources. So alternative narrative explain the historical, social, and political factors behind remarkable scientific progress in Islamic world. And it examines exchange of ideas between civilizations and the impact of Islamic civilization on Renaissance science. And it establishes, it notices that it was highly influential on the Renaissance. And it also makes the point, again, based on primary source research, that the Golden Age was a longer period. It actually started, the scientific activity started before 9th century, and it continued longer. And unfortunately, this alternative narrative is not widely known yet. It is much more recent, and it is usually not taught in schools. And most people simply don't know about it. Okay, so to examine this golden age and to compare classical and alternative narratives, let's take a look at brief history of early Islam. I assume that most of the audience is familiar with the early Islamic history. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but you see, Islam spread in a very short period of time, all the way from Spain to India and China. It was a large portion of the known world at the time. And it was not only about conquering lands, however. It became the center of research and scholarship in very short period of time. But the classical narrative mindset, though, it only looks at political and religious events. So that's why someone like Michael Hart puts Prophet Muhammad as the #1 person, as the most influential persons in history. So I'm sure some of you may have heard of this book, a ranking by this uh, individual, Michael Sculler, who is a highly educated person. Because of the political influence of Islam, he places Prophet Muhammad as the number one person, as the most influential in the entire history, according to his own judgment. Now, there is a lot of irony in this. A lot of Muslims, when they hear about this book, they say, "Oh, how great!" Right? So, a Western, a highly educated Western person, ranks Prophet Muhammad so highly. How great it is! But actually, if you read his description, there is a lot of offensive things about Islam in his description of Prophet Muhammad, and this guy is a white supremacist. He subscribes to white separatist idea, and it's really ironic that, and he also, he's a perfect example of classical narrative mindset in that he completely ignores and overlooks scientific and intellectual contributions of Islamic civilization to modern science. He only looks at political events, right? So, but a lot of Muslims, without looking at the details, they think, "Oh, this is great," right? And they really exaggerate what he's doing and misunderstands what he's doing. Nevertheless, it is true that Islam had such a profound impact on the world history in terms of politics, but missing the point about intellectual and scientific achievements was really unfortunate. So again, in a very short period of time, Islamic world became center of science and research. And how did that happen? Right? So that is the big question. Just like scientific progress everywhere and anytime, you first learn the latest and most up-to-date information about scientific progress. So Muslim scholars learned all the science that they could find, wherever they could find it. And they did not shy away from acquiring science from other civilizations, whether it is from Indian, Persian, or Greek, or any other civilization. Wherever they found it, they took it by following the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. Remember, one of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad was, Muslims are supposed to seek knowledge wherever it may be. And they had in particular great respect for Greek scholars. So for example, they called one of the Greek scholars, philosophers, the first teacher, which refers to Aristotle, right? Aristotle is referred to as the first teacher by Islamic Muslim philosophers. So they had no problem taking sciences from foreign civilizations, including their philosophies, which was a problematic area, as we are going to see in a few minutes. So the classical narrative's explanation of the beginnings of scientific activities in Islam. So in terms of motivation, they say the motivation was Mu'tazila theology that became state ideology for a brief period in some of the Abbasid caliphs in the 9th century, in early to mid 9th century. So they say that was the motivation because Mu'tazila theology emphasizes rational thinking. And remember, they want to bring this paradigm of conflict between religion and science. So according to them, Mu'tazila represents rational thinking in the Islamic world. So that's why Abbasid caliphs encouraged translations and acquiring science and philosophy from other civilizations. And in terms of how it happened, they said, Muslim world got sciences because they came into contact with other civilizations, more advanced civilizations, particularly Greek civilization. And it happened in the, everything started in the 9th century. Caliph al-Ma'mun, and this happens to be, 827 happens to be the reign of Caliph al-Ma'mun and House of Wisdom. The alternative narrative, on the other hand, argues that contact alone doesn't do it, right? So you need to acquire all of these advanced sciences, you need to have the background to understand it and to digest it. So the classical narrative argues that, the interest in sciences started earlier in the Islamic world, going back to the Umayyad period, because in addition to Islam's general encouragement of learning, as we discussed in previous lectures, there was also social, political, and economic conditions that paved the way and internal needs of the state that made it, possible and attractive for people to acquire higher levels of knowledge. So Saliba goes into details of these conditions, and then it came out of Muslim scholars actively seeking the knowledge. It wasn't contact alone that did it. And if you think about it, just coming into contact with advanced knowledge definitely does not make you interested in it and does not make you an expert in it, right? So today, we are in contact with all kinds of advanced knowledge, but that alone just doesn't do anything. You need to have the motivation and the background and impetus to actually learn that advanced knowledge. And also, it also argues that everything started earlier in Umayyad period because it is not possible all of a sudden to understand all of these advanced sciences from Greeks without having any background that makes it possible to understand it. How about in terms of the end of the scientific activity? Classical narrative would say that, it was Imam al-Ghazali who represents, according to them, orthodoxy in Islamic world. Imam al-Ghazali again wrote his book Tahafut al-Falasifa at the end of 11th century in 1095. So they say that was the main reason. Maybe it can be coupled with Mongol invasion of Baghdad in the next century. The alternative narrative argues, based on evidence, that it lasted longer and a lot of original and important and influential scientific works were produced in the Islamic world after the 13th century, after al-Ghazali and after the invasion of Baghdad. And we are going to see more specific examples in the next lecture. So today, we are going to look at al-Ghazali's book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, and his critique and criticism of Muslim philosophers. Now, one amazing thing about this Imam al-Ghazali, I see a lot of experts who blindly repeat this claim that, it was al-Ghazali and his book attacking philosophers that caused the decline in Islamic science. But these experts, a lot of times, have no idea what the book is about, what the purpose of the book was, and what the methodology of the book was. Even though this book, which I have it here in my hands, is available in English translation with original Arabic side by side. It is available to everyone, but just talking about Imam al-Ghazali without reading this book is really amazing. So let's briefly talk about a brief bio of al-Ghazali. So he was born in the year 1058 in the town of Tus in modern-day Iran. So he got a strong religious education from the renowned scholars of his time. He was trained as a lawyer, faqih in Islamic terminology, and theologian or mutakallim. And he was a Shafi in law and Ash'ari in Kalam. But towards the end of his life, he became a Sufi. And in 1091, he became a professor of law at Nizamiye Madrasa in Baghdad. You can think of madrasa as like a religious college, really. And it was like the most prestigious schools, religious schools of his time. So he had a very important position at this institution. So between 1091 and 1095, he wrote Tahafut along with 3 other books. So he first wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa, which means the aims of philosophers, in which he explained the theories of philosophers as a prelude to refuting them in Tahafut. So as an appendix to al-Tahafut, he wrote Mi'yar al-Ilm fil Fann al-Mantiq, which means standard of knowledge in the science of logic, which is an exposition of Avicennan logic. And then he wrote another book, Al-Iqtisad fil I'tiqad, Moderation in Belief, in which he explains his own position. So Tahafut is about refuting and negating philosophers' doctrines. In the next book, he explains and affirms his own beliefs. So towards the end of his life, in 1095, he had a spiritual crisis, and he realized that his motivation in pursuing his career was his worldly glory, and he became completely dissatisfied with this realization. And purely doctrinal and intellectual approach to religion became unsatisfactory to him, and he was convinced that the approach of Sufis was the way to true knowledge. So he decided to forsake his career, his very prestigious career, and follow their path. So he abandoned his position and his family, and he became a wandering ascetic. He resumed a wander. He left Baghdad. He went to Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. He secluded himself in minaret of the great mosques, and he just wandered around, living an ascetic life. And during his time, he wrote his most famous book, Ihya al-Ulumuddin, Renewal of Religious Knowledge, in which he strove to reconcile traditional Islamic beliefs with Sunni teachings. And then he returned to his teaching, to teaching in the year 1106 in Nishapur and Tus, and for the remaining 5 years of his life, he continued to teach. This is the brief summary of his life. So what is the purpose of Tahafut? Which means incoherence of philosophers. So in Tahafut, he criticizes philosophers on 20 specific doctrines, very specific doctrines. So here is the list of them, right? There are 20 problems, and his main point is that he shows that the philosophers failed to demonstrate validity of their claims. That is the whole point of al-Tahafut, right? So here's a specific list. The first one is the philosophers claim that the world is pre-eternal, and they also claim that the world is post-eternal. Of course, they inherited these ideas from Greeks, right? From Aristotle, the first teacher. Remember, they call him the first teacher. And then the remaining doctrines of philosophers. And so to refute them, al-Ghazali first had to explain them, and he did it very, very clearly. So, he did such a good job explaining philosophers that he made philosophy more widely accessible to, non-philosophers. And so, therefore, in doing so, he helped spread philosophical knowledge in the Islamic world. And so his he started a new tradition in Kalam. By the way, Kalam is another an important discipline in the Islamic studies. It literally means speech or word or utterance, and technical meaning is the discipline devoted to discussion of fundamental Islamic beliefs and doctrines. And he used the very logic of philosophers to refute them. And again, he argues that the philosophers failed to demonstrate the validity of their claims. That is the whole point. So this criterion of demonstrability is the most important underlying idea in Tahafut. So in Tahafut, Imam Ghazali does not offer any alternative theological doctrine. He simply says that they fail to establish their claims. That is the whole point, right? So now, al-Ghazali also makes some important points in Tahafut as well as some other books. So he says, he makes a distinction between math and logic versus philosophy, right? So he says it doesn't make sense to oppose mathematical facts, right? It just doesn't make sense because mathematical facts that come from geometry or arithmetic, they are established facts with certainty, so it just doesn't make. And similarly, logic, there is no point in opposing logic. So he says math and logic are neutral in terms of religious ideas and beliefs, and they are accurate sciences. It just makes no sense to oppose math or geometry and logic. And he says it is actually foolish to oppose them because they are established facts with certainty. And in fact, he says it actually harms religion to oppose them under the name of, in the name of defending religion. And he says, the harm caused by such ignorant people is worse and more than educated people who oppose religious beliefs based on philosophy, right? So he makes this distinction, which I think is very important, especially in 11th century, to make this point and this distinction. I think it is a great point he made. And he also says some people, blindly follow those experts, right? They just follow them because, a lot of people think that these high-sounding names such as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they are very sophisticated people. They know math and logic, and so therefore anything and everything they say must be accurate, right? Because these are very sophisticated people, and they are using, very accurate, precise sciences. And he makes similar points in another book called Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error. So he makes this point again that students of math, every student of math is impressed by the precision and clarity of proofs in mathematics. And this leads him to believe that everything else philosophers do, because those times scholars were polymaths. They mastered math and geometry and astronomy and logic as well as philosophy. So a student could make the assumption that everything else philosophers say has the same certainty and of the mathematical facts. So assuming that the same clarity and certainty applies to philosophical claims is a mistake that is easy to make, right? Based on mathematics. Again, he makes this point once again that opposing mathematical facts under the name of defending religion is a foolish thing to do, right? It is worse than those educated people having beliefs in conflict with religious beliefs. So I think these are very important points he made. Now, coming back to specific claims, of the 20 claims, remember, the first one was about pre-eternity of the world, and the second is about the post-eternity of the world. And Greek philosophers, as well as Muslim followers of them, they made these claims. Now, what does, if anything, modern science say about these claims? You know, as we discussed in the first lecture, now it is commonly accepted fact, the Big Bang Theory, now gives us a very precise date about the beginning of the universe, right? 13.8 billion years ago, the Big Bang happened and everything came into existence. You know, universe came into existence. Now, we even have a very exact date for the beginning of the universe, and the same theory, which is universally accepted theory about the cosmology, and again, scientists are in agreement that there will be an end to the universe, and we have two possible scenarios about it. So now this philosophical question now became a question of science, and we have a pretty good answer to it. And we clearly see that philosophers were not correct. They indeed failed to demonstrate their claim, right? And al-Ghazali, well, at least as far as these two claims is concerned, it was al-Ghazali who was correct, not the philosophers. However, those people who talk about as if they are the experts in this matter, they ignore all of these facts. You know, they ignore the purpose and methodology of tahafut, and you know, the specific questions that were addressed in it, and the modern science, you know, say in these questions. I mean, it is simply amazing that there is so much ignorance going on, even among highly educated people. And so this is at the philosophical level. You know, if you look at the content of tahafut, does it make sense that this book should be held responsible for ending the scientific activity in Islam? It is very difficult. I mean, there is no evidence to support that claim, at least based on this book alone, right? I mean, he makes this distinction about mathematical sciences and philosophies, and he takes a purely philosophical approach to criticize philosophers. What is wrong with that, right? What is wrong with engaging a philosophical discussion with philosophers using philosophy, you know? And that is at the philosophical level. At the practical level, did it actually happen, right? Does the evidence from research tell us that the scientific activity actually stopped after al-Ghazali? And we are going to see in the next lecture that it didn't. We have plenty of counterexamples to this claim. We have a lot of research findings after al-Ghazali, and also after Mongol invasion of Baghdad. Very important works, scientific progress, original contributions from Islamic scholars in these post-Ghazali periods that, you know, that simply disproves this claim. So there are some lessons to learn from al-Ghazali. So, you know, we need to learn the facts, and we need to do our homework, not just following the common narrative, even if it is coming from experts. And any apparent conflict between science and religion, religious faith, is usually not a conflict between, is usually between a conflict between philosophical or ideological attachment to science as opposed to science per se, right? And it is important to make a distinction between established fact with mathematical certainty versus ideological and philosophical extensions or interpretations of science, right? So even in astronomy, which al-Ghazali regards as a mathematical discipline, there are actually philosophical assumptions in astronomy that turned out to be actually inaccurate. So once again, from an Islamic point of view, it is simply impossible that there could be any conflict between true scientific facts and true religious dogmas. So, so this is some of the lessons I draw from this discussion. So I will end my presentation today. So I think I took a little more time, but I hope we still have a few minutes for questions. Okay, any questions?
I'll pose a question. We know that al-Ghazali is often considered one of the great thinkers in the history of Islam.
Right.
How was he interpreted going forward? I know Ibn Taymiyyah did not always agree, one of the other great figures in the intellectual history of Islam. It's my understanding that he did not always accept al-Ghazali's teachings. Is that correct, or am I mistaken in that?
So the thing is, my area is not really Islamic philosophy. I look at a very specific work of Imam Ghazali. I'm not a scholar of Imam Ghazali. I did not study all of his works, which is like, right. Which is a whole area of scholarship on its own. So I just focus on this particular book because the claim is made that because of this book, Islamic science came to an end, right? The progress in. So I decided to take a close look at this book, and I discovered a lot of misconceptions and misrepresentations. So I'm not really a scholar on Imam Ghazali or Islamic philosophy. So I will not pretend to know, all of these connections, and but I would say that of course there were always disagreements among scholars, including philosophers as well as religious scholars. Right? Even within Sunni scholars, there are many different, diverse opinions and points of views, and tahafut of Imam al-Ghazali led to another famous Islamic philosopher, Ibn Rushd, to write another book, Tahafut al-Tahafut, right? Incoherence of incoherence. Well, that is great, right? So philosophers being engaged in philosophical discussion, there is nothing wrong with that, right? There is nothing wrong with philosophers refuting each other, discussing, being engaged, in a discussion among themselves. That is exactly what philosophers are supposed to be doing. But representing that as the end of, scientific progress is a bit, misleading. I would also say, though, it is quite possible that some people may have misunderstood Imam Ghazali, and especially his views on causality, right? Again, which I'm not going to go into because this is not really my area. So it is quite possible that he could have been misunderstood by a lot of people. I'm sorry, I will not be able to give a full answer to your question because it is not
really okay.
Area.
Yeah. Just one last point. We know that the Islamic universities, like Al-Azhar University in Cairo, were founded before the universities in the West.
Right.
That this intellectual heritage got passed on in part through these universities like Al-Azhar, which was founded in the 10th century. And perhaps that was another contribution of the Islamic world, was the birth of the university.
I think so. I think the concept of college, as I hinted briefly, is very much related to the institution of madrasa in the Islamic world. Again, I did not do a detailed study on this question, but I think some scholars researched this connection between the institution of college in the West and how it is rooted in institution of madrasa, Islamic schools in the Muslim world. And this is yet another area of research that would be, great for young researchers, right? So my area is very limited. I did not have a training in this field. I am looking at certain subfields of this larger field of Islamic contributions to math and sciences and philosophy. And with this occasion and question, I would like to invite young researchers to take on these issues and do a more in-depth investigation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aydin. We're coming to the end of our time now, but this was a wonderful presentation you gave on the golden age of Islam. You brought new insights for us and how the classical narrative has been inadequate to really understand this period, and also to understand the importance of al-Ghazali and his insights. So thank you very much. We want to let everybody know it'll be 2 weeks before we have the next Islam and Science program, and we look forward to it.
Okay, do you see my slides again? I mean, I would like to remind the audience.
Oh, sure.
Is it showing my slides?
Yes.
The next topic, which will be about the legacy of the golden age of Islamic science, in which I'm going to go into specific details of contributions of Islamic scholars to mathematics and sciences. Since I focus on mathematics, it will be more about mathematics and mathematical sciences, but we'll also mention other disciplines as examples. And we are going to provide more evidence to disprove the classical narrative. And so I hope many of you can join the next presentation that will be in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who participated by coming to this program. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Okay. Good night. And
good night, everyone.